Racism is absolutely alive and well in this country.
There was a lot of anger because there's so much hurt.
Reconciliation is not my responsibility, is not just Indigenous people's responsibility. Let's change, let's transform, let's heal. Welcome to Two Aunties and Reconciliation. Well, welcome back. This is, for those that are just joining us, this is Shapela Matsiam, aka Chief Leanne Joe, one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nation. And I want to welcome back my co-host, Shelley Joseph, my sister, and let her have a quick introduction for those that may be just joining us as well to know who she is. Shelley.
Gela Kesla, Nugo Hakogilo Ogwa Latunlacha Hegums. Gela Kesla, greeting in Kwakwa means come well with me on this journey. My traditional name is Hakwagila Ogwa. My English name is Shelley Joseph. I come from a small village called Hopetown or Hegums.
Awesome. Again, for those that's joining us, welcome to episode 2. We're going to be talking about myths and misconceptions of Indigenous people throughout Canada. And let's begin our episode with, I think everybody knows, myths, biases, stereotypes, just these widely held notions, I guess, generally very negative notions of Indigenous people throughout the whole entire country from coast to coast to coast. And that's what we're going to be delving into today.
All the not fun stuff under racism.
Exactly, because that's literally what it falls under.
Yes.
We're going to be speaking to harm in another episode, and we'll be talking a lot deeper into that space. But I think how we're going to tackle this episode is speak to a myth or misconception, and then speak to what the actual truth is. And so I say, let's just delve into it. Let's begin.
Let's do it.
I think let's begin with, I guess, the notion of that we get a free ride, that everything is just kind of handed to us as Indigenous people. I think that is a really, surprisingly, even though it's 2025 and we've been working in reconciliation for I don't know how many years now, especially, almost every corner of Canada, I would think has a basic notion of reconciliation, but yet here we are doing a podcast on reconciliation and reconciliation, because again, I think many Canadians, settler Canadians, may still struggle with what that means and what that is and everything like that. But
still run into that quite often.
Exactly. And I do in all the work that I do as well, that, it still surprises me about the lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding of the truth and our histories in space when I walk into space. So again, going back to a myth again that we're talking about, that we get a free ride. I guess I'll start with the idea that one, that's absolutely not true. That's a complete myth. We can go into many spaces of why that's not the case. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about, I guess, where this myth has been built. What is it built upon? And I want to go back to, I guess, the colonization of this country, the over capitalistic system that governs our spaces, where we as Indigenous people are not reflected. We're not invited to that table. We're very much a part of the erasure of that worldview and that epistemology and that ontology in those spaces. And I think that will come up a lot throughout our discussions of that truth, that Canada was built on a very racist act called the Indian Act. It was built on, again, capitalism built on the industrial revolutions that happened, on, again, a mindset of a worldview that, again, totally is in great tension with our worldview, pretty much almost the exact opposite of our worldviews. And again, this is where we, I think, struggle in spaces a lot of the times as Indigenous people. But again, we'll keep going back to getting a free ride and acknowledging that all of these misconceptions and these myths are institutionally built. They're systematically built.
Systematic built, and are in all the existing systems still.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Education, capitalism, market economies,
Health system.
the health system.
Justice system.
Exactly. All of it is built on this mindset of, again, less than, dependency, that all of the Canadian taxpayers' dollars pay for everything that we get, etc. But to demystify or to debunk that we get a free ride, let's speak to the fact that, one, that's not true. So as an example, with my nation, and I can't speak for all nations across the country. I can only speak to my lived experience within my community. So there's many spaces I think that we need to cover is on and off reserve, and the ISK funding that comes from being on reserve. So Indigenous Service Canada's money, that's what ISK stands for, is Indigenous Services Transfer Monies, comes to nations. But that is for only on reserve individuals on a per capita basis, meaning those individuals that are members of those nations have to live on reserve within the community for those dollars to be transferred to the nation for health, education, social services, etc. Like all of those, where those transferred, all education, etc. So that is a very small amount of money that comes to our communities for those things. So where does the rest of the money come from? Well, it comes from our own source revenue. It comes from where we generate money as a nation. And I think, hopefully that demystifies and debunks this notion that taxpayers' dollars pay for all of our education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also need to speak to actually that those Indigenous services transfer dollars that do come to the nation for members that live on reserve actually doesn't come from taxpayers' dollars at all.
At all, yeah.
Do you want to share a bit about, or would you like me to share a bit about where those monies come from?
About the trust that the Indian Act gets
Yes.
their money for.
Yes.
I'm not sure the amount in dollars, but I think it's in the trillions.
It's in the trillions.
Yeah, and that's been specifically set aside for all of the bands who are Indian Act bands. And that's where the money comes from, those dollars that you were just speaking to, for people who only live on reserve. So all of us who don't live on reserve were excluded from that, and we...
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Right? So as a person that lives off reserve, my band does not receive any of those Indian trust monies by the federal government for any program or service that is offered.
Yeah.
Right? And that our bands or our nations specifically have to create their own source revenue to apply that equally and equitably to every single nation member, right?
Yeah.
So again, I really want to emphasize that your taxpayers' dollars do not pay for anything. Those Indian trust monies. I am going to share a document um, to our viewers. Yellowhead Institute, beautiful educational institute, has two red papers. One is called Land Back and one is called Cashback. And if you want to learn a lot more about cashback and land back, but cashback specifically talks about those Indian trust monies. Their website, as well as that red paper, really delves into that space beautifully and really understanding, um, again, and really demystifying and debunking
Right.
this space in a really beautiful way. It's very graphic. It's an easy read. And I highly recommend our viewers to go and check out the Yellowhead Institute's red papers because I think it's a reconciliation is doing what we're asking you to do. When we're
Right.
asking you to check out these documents, when we're asking you to check out websites, when we're asking you to take training, that's action, right? So learning and unlearning is an action. So, okay, so we've chatted briefly about getting a free ride.
Yeah.
That includes, I think, a really, really huge myth and misconception that many settler Canadians have is that we all get a free education.
Right.
And I can tell you my education wasn't free in the sense that they think kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't all paid for
No.
by the bands or anything.
Well, very little federal government money actually paid for my education. A majority of my education was actually paid by my own nation, right? So it did come out of those own source revenue funds.
Right. From the money that your nation made off of their own
Exactly.
resources.
From economic development opportunities, from leasing, etc. From whatever economic development the nation undertook. I would venture to guess, and I'm totally guessing, I don't know this offhand, um, but out of every dollar our nation spends, probably less than a quarter or a quarter of that is actually federal funding. So every dollar spent, we are spending up, 75% or more of our own revenue towards all of the programming, all of the services, and all of the business that we do.
Right.
Right. So, that delineates, again, our self sufficiency, our self determination, right? Our self governance, and those sort of things. But yeah, going back to the education piece, so many students I know, even to today, seek out tons of scholarships for their education.
Yeah.
Um,
Scholarships or
student loans.
bursaries.
Exactly. Like, again, there's no actual free education.
Yeah. I know so many Indigenous people who, still have student debts, but they do have the PhDs and the
Exactly.
doctorates and the masters and all of those things.
And let's speak to I guess I would love to speak to why that is, right? So why we still have to go get a student loan or why we have to seek out bursaries and scholarships and that sort of thing. One, we as nations, the education funding agreements that sit between the 600 plus 30 plus First Nations communities in the country
Right.
lack huge gaps in educational funding, massive gaps. So the dollars that every nation receives for education is bare minimum, not even that.
Yeah.
It's probably way less than bare minimum for the amount of demand by their membership for education purposes.
Right.
Rather,
So is that post-secondary?
I would say both K to 12.
Yeah, because I know the schools on reserve are
Oh my God, they're
so highly underfunded compared to all other.
So there's the different types of funding. So there will be education funding for K to 12 on reserve schools, which are the poorest education institutions in this country because of the lack of funding by Indigenous Services Canada
Yeah.
to provide an adequate education to those students that are going to those schools. The other pot would be K-12 funding in sort of the public realm.
Right.
The public institutions, again, very much lacking in funding. As an example, my son has learning differences, certain things are recognized, and the things with his learning differences, there was no extra funding anywhere from ISK, from provinces, etc.
Right. School boards, nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Right? So they had no support, financial support, to help get him the additional support.
Right.
So when I talk about our K-12 provincial system, again, super underfunded for educational purposes for Indigenous youth. And can you imagine, like, I think about in my husband's community, the high school alone is over 50% Indigenous population. And how many of those students have adequate funding for the supports they need? Very minimal. Again, not as bad as our on-reserve education institutions, but again, not too far behind. But then you get to post-secondary, the limitations on funding for past the bachelor's degree. So when you're getting into an MBA program, and in particular an executive MBA, or some sort of executive graduate program, let alone a PhD,
Right.
those become super costly. And the nations, again, when you have such high demand for education, you are spreading very minimal dollars as much as you can to those individuals, which goes back to, again, why we have to take out student debt.
Right.
I mean, even when I went to post-secondary, when I was doing my degree, I worked part-time, right? And then I took some time off and then worked full-time for a while,
Just to stay above water.
just to stay above water, right? Just so that I could survive while I was going to school.
Right.
And that was, again, just paying rent and
Yeah.
paying for groceries and paying my gas in my car and the insurance.
Just
so
living, yeah.
so I could get to school,
Yeah.
right? Kind of thing. So yeah, I think that speaks to hopefully demystifying the fact that all of those Canadians,
Free ride.
free education, that sort of thing. I'd love to speak to the idea of that I guess our culture is, seen as what is it? What's the word? Romanticizing our
Oh, yeah.
culture, right? I think I think that comes with a lot of, we live in a city, in the greater Vancouver area where, well, and even in the province where there's just gazillion tourists everywhere
All the time.
all the time. And so I guess the romanticization of Indigenous people, I think still lives in that energy when people are coming. But also, I'll never forget when I went to your brother Bob's session when he released 21 Things You
Right.
Don't Know About the Indian Act. And I remember being so excited and I wanted to see you guys and going there, but just walking by very large crowd of non-Indigenous Vancouverites. And one lady literally, because I could hear her whispering, "Oh my gosh, there goes an Indian," or something. I can't remember what she said, whether it was Indigenous or First Nations or Indian or something, because she was an elderly lady. But again, it really struck me and hit me hard of like, oh, wow, okay, so we're still here. We're still in that space, and that was quite a few years ago, and we've come a long way, but I think that still very much exists.
Yeah.
And she said it with this intentionality of like, she was in awe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you see a lot of that in the work that you
Oh, yeah. Still, absolutely. And I think that comes from, we've been all but eradicated through the education system and how they speak about us, how they spoke about us in the books, that we were a dying breed. So
Right.
clearly then to see one today is like, wow, they lived.
Exactly.
On one hand, that's true. Yeah, we lived. On the other hand, it wasn't as dire as I think the history books made it out to be, and who we were and us walking on the planet still today.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Experienced it so much, hoping, wow, and when I had long hair, could I touch your hair? Or, things like that. And, oh my gosh.
Makes me grateful that I have never had long hair. Because I can't say I've had that experience.
Yeah.
But,
Or could you say something in Indian to me?
right?
Wow. Yeah.
I love that. That reminds me of a podcast, or not a podcaster, but a influencer, I guess, an Indigenous influencer who makes reels that jokes about
Yeah.
romanticizing Indigenous peoples and language and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff, and it always makes me laugh because I'm just like, this is just so true, and I'm glad that we get to be able to laugh about it.
Yeah. I think that was one of our biggest tools in being resilient throughout all of this,
Right.
is to be able to laugh.
To laugh,
Yeah.
right? To have humor, to go into our deep belly laugh.
Yeah.
And appreciate, I think, I guess the irony and the cruelty and also other spaces to be able to move through that, right?
Trauma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The trauma.
Exactly. Was there other?
I was just going to say, I heard my mother speak one time, my late mother, Donna Joseph, and she floored me with this line. She said, I had the audacity to live and walk and breathe and thrive and strive in a country where they didn't even want me to live.
Right.
Yeah. I was like, wow, Mom. Yeah. Okay.
And I think I witnessed that in my mom, in both my parents. I mean, I think we both experienced that through both of our parents of, it may not be said, but we witnessed that.
Yeah.
We witnessed, our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles, our cousins, like all of our family. But in particular, witnessing our parents, be the giants, because we're literally standing on their shoulders today. But be giants in these spaces, walking into rooms and, commanding it, right? And just saying, yeah, I have the audacity to be here and I'm going to wholly take up that space, right? And I loved that. I loved witnessing that. It was just so empowering.
Yeah.
And beautiful, and there just so much resonates when you see that come to life.
Yeah. The authenticity
Exactly.
outside of the myths. I still do feel it when we walk into spaces and people we might not hear it, but we can sense and have the feeling that, oh, there's an Indian, they're scalpers and, whatever, all the fantasies
Whatever comes up. Yeah, exactly. Well, which also I think we need to talk about how media and how journalism and like every form of media has played really huge roles in these myths and these misconceptions about Indigenous people. I think all around Turtle Island.
Yeah.
But you look at even just look at titles. Like that's one thing I'm going to ask settler Canadians to do is be cognizant when you're listening to the news, when you're reading articles in newspapers, and when you're reading journal papers, or when you're reading books that are Indigenous authors about Indigenous peoples, is be cognizant of that lens, right? And like even simple things like titles of a newspaper article speaks volumes to whether it's a conscious bias, an unconscious bias, to racism, stereotyping, or uplifting these myths and misconceptions about Indigenous people,
Yeah.
right?
When I worked at Reconciliation Canada, somebody came and showed me like really old photos of old clippings of newspapers from back when, MacDonald was still kind of the head of Canada or whatever. And there was
Yeah.
this title of a newspaper calling us, the drunken Indians
Mhm.
or chiefs and their squaws. Like these were headlines
In
in
newspapers. Yeah.
And I thought, wow, this has been handed down on their side for generations.
Yes,
The stereotypes and the
exactly.
biases and everything.
Exactly.
Who's not going to believe the leader of a brand new country? Because it would say that, he said this and he said that.
Right.
Yeah, newcomers are going to come and just believe a leader because why would they lie?
Exactly. Or and they voted for that person to be in that position,
Exactly.
right? So they see them as leaders that know what they're supposed to be talking about. But I'm happy to call that out of
Yeah.
that still exists today, very much.
Yeah.
Our last prime minister was very much of power and privilege, from I think a real old boys club thinking around again this mythology and the notions of Indigenous peoples and going back into the mindset of dependency, that we're all dependent individuals or peoples, again, which is truly not the case. That is a myth unto itself. Absolutely. Do we have challenges and issues within our communities around housing, around education, around addictions, around health? Yeah, but so does every other Canadian.
Yeah.
The only difference is we may be darker skinned.
Right.
Our eyes may be browner or blacker, and so is our hair. But at the end of the day, we're still human beings. I'm just as human as the next settler Canadian
Exactly.
and still facing the exact same issues.
Yeah, we've absolutely been dehumanized.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's, again, a call to action that I think is gonna come throughout each of our episodes, is being able to see all of us as Namoyut, as we're all one.
We're all one. Yeah, we're all interconnected. We're all human. There's only one race on
Exactly.
the planet.
And that's the human race,
Yeah.
right? It reminds me of, I remember when I was doing some of this work with my husband, and he always loved when he was doing introductions and facilitating spaces of reconciliation and that sort of thing, was always um, all my relations.
Right.
And a lot of settler Canadians, were extremely and uncomfortable, right? Because they didn't know what to make of that, because he meant it for everybody, right? Whereas they saw it strictly as an Indigenous and or
Yeah.
our space, right? Like, well, that's for you.
It was the othering.
Exactly. No, that's for you. My husband's just like, let's take a moment here. This is what I mean. And going back to, again, of we're all related because, again, we're all human. We're all spiritual beings coming to have this human experience. Our blood is all the same color.
Right.
So what is delineating about all my relations then?
Yeah.
Right? If we come at a space of thinking and knowing that in our hearts and knowing that in our minds, that there is an equal playing field here.
Yeah.
And there's no need for that othering and
Yeah.
demystify or
To be living in the silos that we've just been born into
yes.
for how many generations now, and we're not even aware of it until two aunties come talking about othering one another. Right?
Exactly.
Only then can we start breaking down the silos that we were just born into. We didn't really have a say. I know I blindly followed my parents' values and beliefs and whatever it was until I was old enough to do some critical thinking. And
Right.
but I think a lot of people in Canada, we live that way. We're born and raised and believe what we were taught in the homes we were raised in. And
Exactly.
only now is the time for us to begin to break down those silos and see each other as human beings. Both my parents went to Indian residential school, and my father, whenever he talks about reconciliation and everything that happened to him in the schools and all of that, he always talked about being dehumanized.
Mm,
That was the underlining. They didn't see him as a human being.
right,
Yeah.
right.
And I think we need to all begin to seeing each other as human beings.
Absolutely. I don't disagree. And coming at it with the lens of love and light in our hearts when we see each other as human beings, right? And, that somebody's richer or poorer or less than you know, or has less than. You know what I mean? Like, because you can see a person as less than by just seeing them as less than, and then financially
Yeah.
also having less than. And again, this is why I will speak to this. And I mean, I know both of us come from that same belief or value that we hold in our hearts is with pure love and light in our hearts in all spaces, no matter what, no matter how difficult or challenging it is. Um, and we also bring tons of laughter into our spaces all the time. And I agree. That's, I think, a theme that I think viewers are going to see throughout all of
Yeah.
that is bringing back to this humanness, to not literally to we are all equal. We need to look at our spaces differently, and that be a call to action. As we move through some of these harder conversations. Okay, let's continue. We could speak to this one if you wanted. There's a criminalization bias. I think I'd like to speak to this a bit briefly. Yes, if you look at statistics in the justice system, we are definitely overrepresented.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yeah.
There's no not speaking that truth that we are definitely overrepresented, which I think creates that myth, and that notion that we are all bad and that,
Yeah.
we all deserve to be in jail or whatever. But that doesn't look deeply to the root causes.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And those root causes were instituted very specifically and targeted towards our erasure.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And I hope that when our viewers listen, that that's what they're honing in on, right? Is that, yes, we can't deny that Indigenous people are overrepresented in
Our
in
justice.
care,
Yeah.
in all justice, all levels of youth detention and, all these different spaces, definitely. However, what are the root causes of that? And what would you identify as some of the root causes to that overrepresentation? What comes to my mind when we talk about that?
First off, I think of intergenerational trauma.
Yep.
Indian residential schools,
Yep.
where all of these children were raised in institutions where you go in, you get a number, they cut your hair, you wear the same clothes, like a uniform as everybody else, you're referred to by number. What does that sound like? Prison system.
Exactly.
And so coming out of these institutions, Indian residential schools, that's all they know.
Yeah.
Nobody taught them about the laws, what's against the law or what is law, because they were literally confined to this institution of Indian residential schools. So coming out with a mentality of living and growing in an institution and coming into society not having the tools to thrive and succeed because nobody taught them about a good education. My father says he didn't get a good education in there. Nobody taught them about a bank account or finances or getting a job or having a resume or how do you find housing. None of that. Nobody taught them anything.
Right.
They come out and are just trying to survive. They get arrested and then they're in this next system,
Exactly.
the justice system. So then it becomes a revolving door for them.
Absolutely.
So they get into the prison systems and still are not taught about
anything.
They're just dehumanized in there, numbered.
Even more.
Yeah. And so they're stuck in that revolving door.
Yes.
And I look at my own life being born to 2 Indian residential school survivors, watching my parents flounder as parents when I was little. And I only know this now with hindsight,
Right.
but they had no clue what they were doing.
Well, exactly. One, you're going back to being raised in institutions. You're not in your own community.
Yeah.
You're not with your own people.
Yeah.
You're not even with being raised by your parents.
Yeah.
Or your aunts and uncles. You don't get to, your cousins are probably in a different residential school, or you're separated by the boys and the girls at residential school, let alone culture,
Yeah.
identity, right?
You have
Like
none.
literally
Individualization.
nothing about
Yeah.
being who you truly are is totally stripped away from you, right?
And then you're judged and condemned and shamed daily, abused daily, malnutrition daily.
Health experiments.
Yeah, health experiments on kids.
Exactly.
It's just shocking.
Exactly. Lack of funding towards those institutions, right? I mean, my mom, literally, they shipped the kids as far away as they possibly could, away from their families and communities,
Yeah.
right? And then when they tried to run in, home, either died, right?
Yeah.
Or were brought back and then were like,
Punished more.
yeah, severely punished,
Yeah.
right? I mean, look at,
Yeah, I think that brings us to the unmarked graves
yes,
now.
exactly.
That's only one small part of how those little children ended up in those
Exactly.
unmarked graves, was they probably came back and got punished.
Exactly. Well, and I think also, I think we'd be remiss in also not speaking to the truth about the amount of abuse that happened in residential schools as well,
Yeah.
right? Like every form of abuse happened there. And I mean, I'm not going to speak to the details of it, but if you can imagine it, it happened.
To children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very young children at that, right? Because most of these children that were taken at a very young age, and shipped off. I mean,
Yeah, so you think of all these children being influenced by these people who are abusing them in every form you can think of. That's what they're learning.
Yeah.
And so they grow up and perpetuate that, because we can only absorb and learn what we're being raised in, what we're influenced by
exactly.
people
And
who are raising us.
And then you come out with the lack of everything that we talked about, but then also going, what do I do with this trauma?
Yeah.
What do I do with all of the abuse that happened to me? Because there was no systems of support
At
all, right? And nor were, our parents allowed to they got to choose, 3 different things that they could do because they weren't allowed to go to post-secondary out of residential school.
Absolutely. We're not permitted to attend any post-secondary institutions.
No, like I remember my dad sharing, like, I didn't want to be a carpenter, but that was the best of the 3 choices that they had offered.
All industrial. Yeah.
Exactly. My mom came to Vancouver because she went to Pittman's Business College because, again, she was told she had to be a secretary. Right?
Yeah.
She had no options. She had no choice. It was like, no, you go do these things. Right? And again, can you imagine? I can't imagine the lack of freedom and the amount of vice grip that even our parents had.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, even our parents. Like one generation ago, never mind.
Many generations ago, let alone our grandparents. Right? My grandmother, my chichia, did not finish residential school because she was beaten so badly for speaking her language.
Yeah.
And that's the only language she knew. Right? And so lacked a formal education.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of thing. And that's why she relied and promoted so heavily on us to go and get that education. Because
once they found out that we could.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So is there one more thing that we want to talk about? I think let's briefly, we could go into economic misconceptions and cultural appropriation. I can speak to economic misconceptions a bit more because I think we touched on that earlier. But because most of my work that I do on a daily basis is economic reconciliation, which is also a dichotomy into itself when we talk about, well, what is economic reconciliation? What does that actually mean? Um, and I'll summarize it in the idea of not only do we still need to have a seat at the economic table, which I think we do, there has to be one more of that there has to be continual growth of having a seat at the economic table. So moving away from the notion of being a stakeholder
Mm,
to understanding we are title and rights holders,
right.
right? I'm not a stakeholder. I am a title and a right holder under Section 35 of the Constitution that protects my title and my right as a Scotish member. And that unto itself requires not only consultation, partnership, free, prior, and informed consent, all of those spaces, and as well as sitting at that table, having those negotiations, having those discussions around being a true partner in economic development. But then my work imbues the idea or future thought leadership around what would we do if we could transform that table? What would it look like if we decolonized what the table looked like for economic development for our people, using our values, using our worldviews, using our cultural protocols and those ancestral teachings. All if we imbued and embedded all of these into that space, what would capitalism and a desired future economic state look like, right? That for me, like, gets me super excited. I could talk all day about that kind of thing, but I'll close with that of for our viewers around these economic misconceptions. We are not dependent people. We do not see ourselves as scarce, right? I don't believe in scarcity. I don't believe in a scarcity mindset. I believe in I am truly wealthy, right? And not in the sense of I have $1 more in my bank account than you.
Yeah.
No, I
That's
mean,
ego.
yes, exactly. That's pure ego. That's pure capitalism. That's pure colonial thought, right? My heart is full. One, because you're sitting across from me today. That is wealth. Brings tears to my eyes to be able to say, my sister said yes when I invited her to come and speak with me today and on in those episodes. That is the wealthiest I could possibly be because we have this relationship. And I think that that doesn't take place. That kind of understanding of wealth is so missing
Yeah, absolutely.
in our economic spaces. I could go so much deeper, but I won't. But let's also speak to maybe a bit about, we'll wrap up maybe with cultural appropriation and
Right.
how that is played out,
Yeah.
on Turtle Island and globally,
Yeah.
kind of thing. Let's speak to, I guess the easiest ones, again, go back to media promoting, this romanticism of
Yeah.
who we are, but also in particular the really uplifting of the notion of that we're savages and we're heathens that really comes out in sports teams, with the tomahawks and cartoons. You look at cartoons as well. I never thought of it when I was a kid,
Yeah.
but watching the cartoons and going, "What? That's not a true representation of me or who we are or any Indigenous person."
Yeah. Or when we were kids and everybody's playing cowboys and Indians, and the cowboys always won because that's how it happened on TV.
Exactly. Well, yeah, you think back to, again, early television, again,
Stereotyping.
very stereotyping,
Yeah.
very racist and
And that planted little tapes in my head about shame.
right.
I fought it really hard to not feel shame for being Indigenous.
Right.
But I lived in an all white community in a little fishing town and there's a pulp mill. So it was
Right.
back in the 70s. racism was kind of okay in the public and out loud. So it was like on a daily basis, being called a dirty little Indian or a stupid little Indian or go back to the reserve because I grew up off reserve.
Right.
And my father raised us off reserve because he didn't want us going to Indian residential schools
Right.
because it was still a thing at the time.
Exactly.
And I don't consider myself old, so this isn't historic in my eyes at
No.
all. So I grew up off reserve and experienced all of that racism. And so it was literally a daily fight
Right.
just to stand in my authenticity as a Native person,
I know.
Indigenous.
Right.
Yeah. So, there's these little funny jokes. They're not that funny.
No.
Because that played things in my head like over
Oh,
and
yeah.
over again for so long. Shame that wasn't mine to carry.
No. Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. And I hope that I'll close with, we'll wrap this up, I guess, because that's a beautiful place to close, with the uncomfortableness
Yeah.
that I think some of our viewers or many of our viewers may feel with that truth.
Yeah.
Right? That weight,
Yeah.
even though that still sits with us. I know that our sons can't go out in the public
Yeah.
without being profiled.
Absolutely.
Right? I really want viewers to really sit with that. Do your children go into a store and are they profiled immediately? Followed, right?
Yeah.
Security cameras moving on them, right? Etc. I mean, I know that I get followed, but can you imagine like what our sons feel?
Yeah. Being young.
Exactly.
Teenagers.
Exactly.
Still developing and forming
Exactly.
identity and then
Yes.
have this cast on them, this
Exactly.
racism.
Exactly. And I want to bring this to light that none of this is historical.
Yeah.
None of this is in the past. These are all things that we're still dealing with. And that the onus isn't just on you or I sitting here filming this podcast, right? The responsibility solely isn't ours. It is every single settler Canadian's responsibility.
Yeah.
Whether you have been here for generations or you're just a newcomer, it is just as much your responsibility. You are just as accountable to the learning, the unlearning, to demystifying, to debunking, to knowing the truth, and in particular, being potentially really uncomfortable with that truth.
Yeah, absolutely. The work that I do at Letters to Counties to training, I ask participants to take a deep look at your biases.
Yeah.
And it's hard.
It's very hard.
Yeah. Even I have biases and I'm still working on them.
Yeah.
A lot of the time.
Well,
But that's the invitation, is for people, have a look at your biases and think about, how do you think that makes the people feel around you?
right. Where did they come from also?
Yeah.
Like, be curious about where did they come from? How was this instituted in your being?
Yeah.
And then how do you move away?
Yeah.
And how do you move through? Because you have to move away before you can move through. How do you move through that uncomfortableness, the unsettlingness of that? Because so much of our institutions, let's not deal with that,
Yeah.
right? Because if we did, we wouldn't be where we are. We would not be having a podcast on reconciliation, having two beautiful aunties, speaking about this space. Again, I want to emphasize and close with the idea that us having an authentic conversation and dialogue is literally, it's not to shame.
Yeah.
It's not to be angry.
Yeah.
It's not to point fingers. It's not anything.
Yeah.
We're coming at this with love and light in our hearts, with the intentionality that we hope that it sheds some light, that it brings about you being accountable and being responsible to delve deeper into these subject matters, to go take a training, to read a book, to read.
Yeah.
an author, an Indigenous, beautiful human being that wrote a book.
Yeah.
And there's so many of them.
Mhm.
There's so many out there to participate in um, Indigenous History Month, to participate in, Orange T-shirt Day. That's the other beautiful book that sits with us today too. Is Orange September 30th, and participate in everything that you can.
Yeah.
And build relationship. I always ask when I do my trainings, or when I'm facilitating spaces, I'm like, "Do you know an Indigenous person?
Mhm.
If not, why not?"
Yeah.
Right? Like, what's holding you back, right? If we're in a state of true reconciliation in this country, how do you not know an Indigenous person,
Yeah.
right?
When I worked at Reconciliation Canada, Thunder was 6,
Mhm.
and he was pretending to be an interviewer because he was watching everything that was going on. So he pretended he was like a newspaper person, and he couldn't write, so it was just scribbles on a paper, but he's asking us questions
I love it.
about reconciliation at 6. He knew this word reconciliation.
Mhm.
And then he stopped asking the questions, and he kind of, threw his hands in his lap, and he said, "So you mean it's about being friends?" I said,
Exactly.
It's
that simple. It's about relationship
relationship. Yeah.
building.
And he got that at 6.
I know. And that's our hope.
Yeah.
That's our hope, I think, through us sitting together and people listening,
Yeah.
is that, it's about healing,
Yeah.
forgiveness, relationship building, right? And mending broken systems and institutions and spaces
Yeah.
together.
Together. Yeah. I always end everything with love. Love is the answer for everything. Unconditional love, inviting everybody into the fold.
Exactly. And again, that's our intentionality. And we'll close with that. So thank
Awesome.
you again for being here with me today. My heart soars because we're able to share this space together.